Welcome to my little mini Prezi Camstasia presentation on autoethnography. I'm sure I'm going to look back on this in a year and chuckle at my newness to the technology, but nonetheless, here I am. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about autoethnography, what it is and what some of the important aspects are about it. And the way that I'm going to do that is talk about autoethnography as a genre. Hopefully by the end of this I'll know how to pronounce it and spell it. And I'm going to weave in some bits and pieces about the context in which I'd like to use it, because as you'll find out, autoethnography is quite contextual, and so I think doing that will help to illustrate autoethnography in a autoethnographical sort of spirit. So let's go ahead. Autoethnography, with a great big pause, is defined by Ellis, who's one of the primary writers and researchers about the genre. Autoethnography is an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze the graphy or personal experience with the auto in order to understand cultural experience, the ethno. And so really what's happening here is an autoethnographer is using a combination of personal experience, but what's really key about it is they're relating it to cultural elements and cultural aspects. Another couple of researchers, Kempster and Isaac White, have a comprehensive definition, and it is: autoethnography moves from the breadth of the social lens that is the focus of ethnography to the narrative perspective of the situated individual. The auto is the self, where discovery is centered, and the ethno is the self shaped by his or her social milieu. And the graphy is the writing of the self as the primary. So there's these very key links between the self and the larger, broader cultural and contextual experience. In this particular case, as many of you now know, what I'm really looking at researching in my bigger sort of research picture is looking at how physical activity impacts leadership development. And one of the elements about leadership that I think autoethnography is such a good genre to study it with is that leadership is situational and contextual as well. And by contextual, I mean that the situation or the circumstances arising around a leader's ability to do his or her job or fulfill his and her role are completely varied. So looking at a genre that creates the ability for that to be able to do that is really pertinent in this particular case. Where did autoethnography come from? It arose in the late or mid 1980s when scholars had become troubled by ontological, epistemological, and axiological limitations of traditional social science. So that notion of canonical laws, and as Tim I think he articulated it really well beginning in the course when he talked about obese children. And so we know that children are obese, so we study how many children are obese, and then we study, what socioeconomic class do we find more obese children in, and, what sorts of things are the obese children eating, and we do all of these things, but we don't really look at the deeper piece, which is what are the factors that are actually causing and contributing to the obese, and even more importantly, what are the ways in which we can actually do something about it. So autoethnography really did arise at that time when researchers were beginning to look at some deeper ways of analyzing and looking at things. In terms of truth-seeking, autoethnography is more than a personal story, and that's one of the things that it can be criticized for, is being really sort of introspective. It does seek verisimilitude, and I don't know if I said that correctly, but it does seek that. And what's really important in terms of truth-seeking is the credibility of the narrator. So is what the narrator saying plausible and real? And if the narrator or the autoethnographer has not been immersed in the situation that he or she is writing about deeply and over a long period of time, then there really are some questions about credibility. One of the other ways that autoethnography can sort of really find a way to speak truth is in the coding of the data and sort of the choosing of the stories that the person tells. So I know in my own experience, when I'm looking at writing an autoethnography about my own research experiences, I'm looking specifically at which stories is it that I want to tell that specifically act as a window or a door to look at a larger, broader sort of social context or phenomena. So, for example, what's a story that really illustrates my experience being a senior level leader as a woman? Or what's a story that really illustrates my experience as a leader being the oldest of 7 children? So the stories that I tell aren't just sort of randomly selected out of nowhere. There's some very careful thought about which stories it is that you're going to tell, and specifically how you're going to link them to the data. One of the other ways that an autoethnographer can really find truth is in the ability to be vulnerable themselves in terms of the stories that they're telling. And Carolyn Ellis, who again is one of the key authors around autoethnography, wrote an article called, I think it actually was a book, called Heartfelt Autoethnography. And there was a part of discovering that title that kind of made me go, really? Do I want to be that vulnerable? And in it, she uses the example of a PhD student who's come to her to approach her to be on her PhD committee. And the student wants to study survivors of breast cancer. And Ellis asks the student, the student says, oh yes, and Ellis asks the student, have you had breast cancer? And the student says, yes, but don't worry, I won't let it bias my research. And Ellis says, but of course you will. And then they go on to sort of interview back and forth, and in the article, Ellis uses the dialogue between them to sort of illustrate the conversation that ensues, which is really about how her own experience with surviving breast cancer is actually fundamentally important to her ability to be able to study it, and that her ability to expose her vulnerability with that is actually a way that she's going to be able to connect with the people who she's researching, or the people that she's researching with. So then, in terms of validity, it's a little bit more difficult with something like autoethnography to establish a validity, but because what the autoethnography is seeking to do is to impact other people in a way that catalyzes or sparks something for them, Ellis says that it's really important that autoethnography be evocative and heartfelt, meaning that it be written in a way that really does attempt to connect, and that it offers a way for readers to improve sort of their own current state of being. And that in the construction of the data and narrative, there really is a purpose of offering it to others. So the validity comes from writing the story because you want it to serve a greater purpose than your own cathartic sort of resolution of the issues. And that's really key for autoethnography, and certainly a part of how the validity is established. The next element, reliability. Ellis talks about reliability in autoethnography as being a bit unorthodox, and that really it's about the credibility of the researcher, which I talked a little bit about in Truth as well, but also that the autoethnography is written from a situated perspective, so that perspective is consistent throughout the autoethnography, and that with that, the autoethnographer is really trying to find a coherent way to link the present, the past, and the future. And that the reliability comes from a very thoughtful, intentful, and purposeful integration of the situated perspective, past, present, and future, and also the link between the autoethnographer and the broader sort of social constructs that affect it. And so that's where reliability comes from, in my understanding. And so then those 3 elements, reliability, validity, and truth-seeking, are really important in terms of how we construct the study. And so in my own autoethnography around my own research, one of the things I'm endeavoring to do is to be vulnerable in the way that Ellis suggests, and also to look at very carefully constructing which stories I pick, and be very thoughtful and intentful about specifically what it is that those stories are illustrating, and to have those stories be grounded and situated in my perspective of a leader in a specific situation. And so that becomes kind of the reliable, situated center of that particular autoethnography. The other thing that needs to be considered with autoethnography is the ethical piece. And so because the work is interrelational, that means that the researcher and the people that you're doing research with are completely interrelated. And so it's really important for the researcher to acknowledge that, and to be aware of that, and to be cognizant of that. And that one of the ways you can really kind of check it is, for example, there's people that I worked with during my time as a leader who I can show my work to check sort of details, perspective, those sorts of things, and then I can incorporate their feedback and their thoughts and their insights into it as a way of ensuring that it is an actual, well, I'll be careful about using that word, but valid representation of what occurred. And then the other piece too is that there might be a confidentiality element. So in my own autoethnography, for example, maybe I'm okay telling the details of my personal experience, but maybe other people who were in it are not. And so the autoethnographer needs to be careful about protecting the, privacy and confidentiality of the people that you're doing the research with. And so, like many of the qualitative research genres, what's key about autoethnography is that the researcher is really at the center of the research. What I particularly love about this genre, when you think about looking at leadership, is that it's situational, contextual, and that the reality comes from an intersubjective point of view. So because the autoethnographer is taking self and relating it to other people and relating it to the broader cultural landscape of social reality, the perspective then becomes that intersubjective quadrant that Ken Wilber writes about. And the situational and contextual pieces mean that this particular way of research has a way of accounting for the fact that one leader may be operating in an environment that is highly favorable and things are great and things are wonderful, and another leader might be operating in an environment where there's scarcity of resources, etc. And so with the autoethnography, it enables you to capture in great detail the situation that the individual is in, as well as the context in which he or she is operating in. And interestingly enough, when I started to delve into the autoethnographical research, I found that there is some literature that's pointing to the applicability of autoethnography to be used in a leadership context, and also notes that it hasn't been done a lot before. And I know from my own studying about leadership that the studies are very sort of quantitatively and performance based, which I always think is a little bit funny, because I think sometimes a quantitative representation is really actually qualitative, sort of disguised in a number. So for example, I might be asked as someone rating a leader to rate his or her communication skills on a scale of 1 to 10, but where I indicate that rating is really very subjective and very qualitative. I'm just giving it a quantitative, value. So I do believe that there's some tremendous possibility for autoethnography to be used as a way to look more deeply at leadership. And I think one of the things that really strikes me that I'm so excited about is I think that it's a very powerful vehicle for leaders to reflect on their own leadership, and that part of great leadership really is that reflexivity. And so even if a leader only wrote an autoethnography for the purposes of his or her own reflection, that would be helpful. However, the overall sort of intent of it is that it does have a broader reach, and that's certainly what I'm hoping for. So I hope that gives you a sense of autoethnography, sort of what it is, and a little bit of how I'm going to be applying that to my own research, and that in doing that, I give you a sense of how that may happen for you as well. So thanks so much, and I look forward to watching all of your presentations as well. If I can figure out how to actually stop my presentation.